In 1860, 600 men gathered beneath a city block in Chicago. They positioned themselves under shops, offices, print houses, and a bank. Above them sat 35,000 tons of brick, stone, and iron, 4 and 5 stories of occupied buildings stretching 320 feet along Lake Street. Inside those buildings, customers browsed merchandise, clerks filed paperwork, business owners counted inventory. And below their feet, those 600 men began turning 6,000 jackscrews in perfect synchronization. Over 5 days, the entire block rose nearly 5 feet into the air. Not a single window cracked, not a single wall shifted. The people inside barely noticed. This happened. This is documented. This is celebrated in engineering textbooks and city histories as one of the great achievements of American ingenuity. And somehow, that makes it stranger than if they had tried to hide it. I found Chicago while researching something else entirely. I was cataloguing examples of buried first floors, those strange basement windows that sit at street level in old cities around the world, the ones that Mudflood researchers point to as evidence of catastrophic burial events. I expected to find denials, explanations about decorative architecture, the usual dismissals. Instead, I found the opposite. I found a city that admitted, in extraordinary detail, to burying itself on purpose. They didn't hide what they did. They wrote it down, published it in newspapers, sold tickets to watch it happen. The question isn't whether Chicago was razed. The question is whether the official explanation actually explains anything at all. The story begins with cholera. In 1854, an epidemic swept through Chicago and killed 6% of the population in a single summer. The city sat barely 4 feet above Lake Michigan on clay marsh that refused to drain. Streets became rivers of mud so deep they reportedly swallowed dogs and small children. Standing water collected everywhere, breeding disease. Residents joked that when you turned on your faucet, you got fish. The sewage had nowhere to go because the land was too flat, so it pooled in the streets and seeped into the drinking water, and the dying continued year after year. Something had to change. In 1855, the city hired an engineer named Ellis Sylvester Chesbrough. He had designed Boston's water system and came highly recommended, though nothing in his background suggested he was about to attempt the impossible. Chesbrough's plan was elegant in theory and insane in practice. He proposed building the sewer system above ground first, laying the pipes on top of the existing streets, and then raising the entire city to cover them. Every street would go up 4 to 14 feet. Every building would have to follow. The first masonry building went up in January 1858. A 4-story brick structure at the corner of Randolph and Dearborn, 70 feet long and weighing 750 tons. Workers positioned 200 jackscrews beneath it, and over several days they lifted the entire building 6 feet and 2 inches into the air. The newspapers reported it rose without the slightest injury to the building. This was the first of more than 50 large masonry buildings raised that same year. By autumn, they were lifting rows of brick buildings over 100 feet long. The following spring, they doubled that length again. The contractors who made this possible became celebrities. James Brown arrived from Boston, where he had moved buildings for canal construction. He partnered with Chicago engineer James Hollingsworth, and together they became the busiest building raisers in the city. But the name that catches my attention is George Pullman. Yes, that Pullman. The man who would later build the famous sleeping cars that revolutionized railroad travel. The man who would construct an entire company town for his workers and then refuse to lower their rents during a depression, sparking one of the most violent labor conflicts in American history. The man whose body had to be encased in concrete and steel railroad ties because his workers hated him so much that his family feared they would dig him up. That George Pullman got his start lifting buildings in Chicago. Pullman arrived in 1857 and quickly proved himself. His first major contract was the Madison House, a large brick hotel that he elevated 5 feet in under a month. Then came the Briggs House, then partnership in the massive Lake Street project, then the crown jewel. In 1861, Pullman and his partners raised the Tremont House. This was a 6-story luxury hotel covering more than an acre of ground, one of the largest buildings in Chicago, filled with wealthy guests including several VIPs and a United States Senator. 500 men operated 5,000 jackscrews from covered trenches beneath the structure. The hotel rose 6 feet without incident. Most of the guests had no idea it was happening. One patron later reported confusion that the front steps seemed to be getting steeper every day. When he checked out, the windows that had been at eye level were now several feet above his head. The scale of what happened next defies casual description. Buildings weren't just raised, they were moved. Entire wooden structures, sometimes whole rows of them, were placed on rollers and wheeled through the streets to make room for new masonry construction. A traveler named David McCrae wrote that never a day passed during his stay in Chicago that he didn't encounter one or more houses shifting their quarters. One day, he met 9. The horse cars had to stop twice on Great Madison Street to let houses cross. This wasn't treated as extraordinary. This was traffic. I keep returning to the synchronization required. 6,000 jackscrews beneath a single block, 600 men turning them in perfect coordination. If one section rose faster than another, the building would crack. If the timing failed, walls would collapse. Yet somehow, in a city that had been incorporated barely 30 years earlier, that had grown from 50 people to over 100,000 in a single generation, they perfected this technology almost immediately. The technique appeared fully formed and functioned flawlessly from the start. The official history treats this as evidence of American ingenuity, of can-do spirit and engineering brilliance. But it raises an uncomfortable question. Where did this knowledge come from? George Pullman learned his trade from his father, who had moved buildings along the Erie Canal using jackscrews and a patented device of his own design. So the technology existed before Chicago. But the scale in Chicago was unprecedented. Nothing in the historical record explains how they jumped from moving canal warehouses to lifting occupied city blocks without apparent trial and error, without documented failures, without a learning curve of any kind. The skill simply appeared when it was needed, and then it all burned. October 8, 1871. The Great Chicago Fire begins around 9 in the evening in a barn on DeKoven Street. Over the next 2 days, it destroys 17,450 buildings across 3.5 square miles. 300 people perish. 100,000 are left homeless. The business district that had just been razed at enormous expense is completely obliterated. And here is where the story takes a turn I wasn't expecting. The same night, the same hour, 200 miles north in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, another fire ignites. This one burns 1.2 million acres and takes between 1,200 lives, making it the deadliest fire in American history. The exact death toll is unknown because all the local records were destroyed. The same night, Port Huron, Michigan burns, Holland, Michigan burns, Manistee, Michigan burns. 5 major fires across 3 states, all beginning on the same evening. The official explanation is weather. A long drought had left the region dangerously dry. Strong southwest winds fanned the flames. The fires were tragic coincidences of climate and combustible wooden construction. But speculation about the simultaneous outbreaks began almost immediately and has never fully stopped. As early as 1883, researchers proposed that fragments from Biela's comet might have caused the fires. Witnesses reported blue flames and fire falling from the sky. The behavior of the blazes was described as tornado and hurricane. In 2004, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics published a paper revisiting the comet theory. The official position remains coincidence. The pattern remains unexplained. What we know for certain is what was lost. Chicago's pre-fire records burned. The buildings that had been razed at such expense burned. The documentation of who had lived in those buildings and what had been beneath them burned. The city rebuilt quickly, this time with strict fire codes requiring masonry construction. The old Chicago, the one that had been lifted into the air, was replaced entirely. Within 20 years, the population had grown from 300,000 to over 1 million. The razed city became a footnote, an engineering curiosity, a fun fact for tourists. But Chicago wasn't the only city that chose this solution. 18 years later, on June 6, 1889, the Great Seattle Fire destroyed 25 blocks of the city's downtown. Within days, city leaders decided to raise the streets 12 to 30 feet. The method was similar to Chicago's, though even more dramatic. They built retaining walls along the streets, then sluiced down nearby hills to fill the space between. Buildings that survived the fire found their first floors suddenly underground. Merchants continued operating at the old street level while construction proceeded above them. Customers climbed down ladders to reach the subterranean storefronts. Glass vault lights were installed in the new sidewalks to let daylight through. Eventually, the underground levels were abandoned. The city built new sidewalks that sealed them off entirely. In 1907, the Seattle Underground was condemned over fears of bubonic plague. The buried streets became opium dens and speakeasies and homeless shelters, then faded from memory altogether. Today, you can take a tour and walk through the remains. You can see the old storefront windows staring out at retaining walls. You can stand in what was once street level and look up at the glass lights in the ceiling that used to be the sidewalk. Seattle and Chicago. Two cities, two fires, the same solution. Both razed their streets. Both buried their original ground floors. Both lost their pre-fire records. Both treat the razing as a triumph of engineering over adversity. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. And then there is the matter of the 1890 census. This census was special. It was the first to use electrical tabulation, the first to document families on individual schedules, the most comprehensive record of American population in the post-Civil War era. It captured the nation at the exact moment when these razed cities were being completed, when the generation that remembered the before was still alive to answer questions. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. The 1890 census records were stacked outside the fireproof vault. The census records from other decades, the 1830s, 1840s, 1880s, 1900s, and 1910, were stored safely inside the vault. 25% of the 1890 records were destroyed immediately. Another 50% sustained serious water and smoke damage. The investigation never determined a cause. The damaged records sat in a warehouse for 12 years. Historians and genealogists protested plans to destroy what remained. The government denied any such plans. Then, quietly, in February 1933, Congress authorized the destruction anyway. One day earlier, President Herbert Hoover had laid the cornerstone for the new National Archives building. The records that would have documented America during the era of the razed cities, the buried first floors, the simultaneous fires, were gone before the archives opened. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming definitive proof of conspiracy. I am pointing out a pattern that the official narrative does not adequately address. Chicago razed its buildings using technology that appeared fully formed. Multiple cities burned on the same night. The census that documented that era was destroyed under suspicious circumstances. Every question leads to another question, and the answers always seem to circle back to coincidence, tragedy, lost records, move along. But consider what we're being asked to believe, that a city barely 30 years old developed the expertise to lift occupied buildings weighing tens of thousands of tons without significant trial and error. That 5 major fires ignited independently across 3 states on the same evening by chance. That the one census recording the population during this transformation was stored outside the fireproof vault by accident and then destroyed despite protests. That cities worldwide ended up with buried first floors and basement windows at street level through unrelated processes that all happened to occur in the same historical period. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. What was beneath Chicago before they razed it? What did George Pullman's workers find in those covered trenches below the Tremont House? What stood at the original street level in Seattle before they sluiced the hills down to bury it? We cannot know because the physical evidence was sealed beneath new construction, and the documentary evidence was consumed by flames that struck with impossible coordination. The buildings were razed, the fires burned, the records disappeared. And we are told this is all coincidence, all tragedy, all brilliant engineering solving practical problems that arose naturally from swamps and disease. But I keep returning to those 600 men beneath that city block, turning their jackscrews in perfect unison, while shoppers browsed above them unaware. I keep thinking about George Pullman and where he went next, building luxury railroad cars and company towns, accumulating power and wealth and secrets. I keep seeing those basement windows at street level in cities across the world, the ones that don't make sense until you imagine what might be below them. Chicago wasn't just lifted into the air, something was buried beneath. And whatever it was, they made sure we would never find out what used to be there. What else vanished when the ground level changed? What else have we been taught to forget?